Privilege, according to Alan Johnson, who's the trainer who came to Naropa some years ago, privilege is an advantage that is unearned, exclusive, and socially conferred. I'd like to talk about this definition. It's a very simple definition. Privilege is an advantage that is unearned, exclusive, and socially conferred. Unearned. Let's look at unearned. Unearned means that it's not something that is based on hard work or lack of hard work. It's not based on study or practice. It's not based upon becoming enlightened or not practicing and not becoming enlightened. It's based upon birth. It's based on something that we were born into. And when advantages are unearned in this way, it means just by virtue of being born white, I have certain privileges in the world that I live in that make it easier for me, that mean that I have fewer barriers, fewer obstacles in my life. When I go into situations as a white woman, I'm given the benefit of the doubt, where a person of color would not be given the benefit of the doubt. It's assumed that I'm going to succeed more quickly than for people of color. There are all kinds of social advantages to being heterosexual, and when I'm social in various situations, people ask me about my husband and my family. And as a person with a different sexual orientation, I would have to always be extremely careful about how I worded my partnership, the gender of my partner, the issue of whether I have children or not. There are a lot of things about my private life that I would be hesitant to share because of my sexual orientation. These are all issues that are very unspoken in the area of privilege. And so unearned means that just by virtue of the fact of being born white, I have a certain ease in the mainstream of society that people of color, people of a different sexual orientation, people with disabilities simply do not have. And of course, I know about this because as a woman, being in a world, particularly when I was a young academic, going to academic conferences where almost everybody was male, I saw how these advantages worked for the men there. And as a woman, I studied the men, and I learned how to survive in a world dominated by men. These are ways in which that I learned about male privilege, and I learned to navigate the world of privilege as a woman. As a white person, I am completely unaware of how it is that people of color have to also navigate in that way. This is something I've come to understand over time, that there's a tremendous difficulty when I have unearned privilege to understand the oppression that people who do not have my privilege experience in their world. The other side of privilege is oppression. And the oppression that people of color receive is also unearned. It's important to understand that there's privilege and then there's oppression. Let's go to the second category of privilege, an advantage that is exclusive. That is, it is an advantage that not everybody has. It's exclusive, meaning that I, as a white person, receive certain preferential treatment that people of color do not receive. That's a very important aspect as well. It means that the leadership of major corporations are, generally speaking, people who are white. Men especially, but also women. And it's very unusual for people of color to be in the very top CEO positions of corporations. It's rare for women to be there, but it is more common for women to be there than for people of color. The third part of the definition is socially conferred, meaning that the privilege that I have has nothing to do with basic goodness. It has to do with a society that has excluded and included for the benefit of the few. And so these are social definitions. They are created by society. Now, the wonderful part about this is because they are socially created, they can also be socially reframed. And it is interesting that one could become very depressed by thinking about privilege and how privilege works. But seeing that it comes from causes and conditions, it means that it can be redone, it can be undone. And this is part of our responsibility in creating enlightened society. So I'd like to take a moment and think about, here I am, a white woman sitting here giving this talk. I'm an educated white woman. I'm an Acharya of Shambhala, so I have enormous privilege in Shambhala, so that you are more likely quickly to trust what I'm doing and think that I'm doing a good job with this talk. You are more likely to give me credibility because of being white, heterosexual, educated, only slightly disabled with my deafness. You are more quickly ready to give me respect and to listen to what I'm saying. This is because of privilege. You would be more naturally critical of someone who was an oppressed person who's sitting here and giving this talk. Again, this is how privilege works in our society. I am hoping in this situation to use my privilege as a way to uncover privilege, because privilege is not a compliment. Privilege is a socially constructed way of creating barriers between people and barriers to creating enlightened society. So at this point, it's important for us to step back from privilege and to think of ways that we are privileged in our life and we are oppressed in our life. All of us have areas of privilege and areas of oppression. When we experience the oppression, whatever way it may take place, it may be economically oppressed. In the economies of the world, many people who are privileged in other ways are economically oppressed. It's important for us to understand that privilege and oppression are fundamentally barriers between human beings, one-on-one, in communities, in societies, and in the systems of our world. And until we begin to look carefully and closely at how privilege separates us, including at times, excluding at times, and creates a barrier to realizing the basic goodness of society, until we really look at this closely, we will have a difficult time as Shambhalians developing enlightened society within Shambhala, and certainly beyond Shambhala in the world in which we live. So one last thing I'd like to treat before this talk is over, and then we will have a discussion. It may be that some of you listening to this talk would say, I'm not privileged. I don't have any privilege. I have no idea what you're talking about. This is how I have felt at times as well. You know, as a woman, I've run into all kinds of obstacles, but in every other way, I have no idea what you're talking about. This is spoken of as the luxury of obliviousness. That is, when we live in privilege, it means that we have the luxury of not having to think about it. James Baldwin said that privilege means that you don't see privilege. He says to be white in America means not having to think about it at all. And it's true that when we live in privilege, we don't have to think about it. We're lulled into feeling that everything's fine, that nobody's being hurt by my lifestyle or by what I'm doing with my energy, with my intelligence, with my time. But what we understand from colonial literature, and I think about Nandi's book, The Intimate Enemy, that the oppressor who is often oblivious to that oppression. The oppressor asks that the oppressed become just like the oppressor. And it means that women in the halls of power study men and find out how to succeed in a world dominated by men, sometimes by becoming more masculine than men themselves. People of color understand the dynamics of white people and have learned to navigate in a way to make sure that they can be as free of harassment as possible. But it means constantly being vigilant about where they go, what they do, making sure that they don't dominate conversations, making sure that they are low profile when out in public, preparing themselves for the routine traffic stop, for being suspected of crimes in all kinds of situations that are completely innocent. This is what it means to have the luxury of obliviousness, is that when we live in privilege, we have no idea what it's like to live in oppression. And so becoming aware of that, understanding that, is a way of removing the barriers to creating enlightened society. It's a responsibility for us as privileged people, whatever areas of privilege we have in our life, to begin to understand the structure of this. Oppressed people live with internalized oppression, doubting their own basic goodness, doubting their own worth and their humanity because of the structures of oppression that have told them that they are bad, they are unworthy, that they are less than human. And it's very important that we as a society remove those barriers, remove that oppression wherever it occurs, and develop a sense of the fundamental humanity of every human being in our society, and to support that humanity in structural ways in society as well as in one-on-one situations. So I've said a lot today. I hope that this will lead to a good discussion about systems, interlocking systems of privilege, systems of oppression in our world, and so that we can really begin to understand how it is that we could remove these barriers to creating enlightened society. That is the path of true warriorship. Thank you so much, and please gather, and there will be discussion questions handed out for you to discuss in small groups the questions that have arisen from this talk. And thank you for coming to this talk on diversity in Shambhala. We'll close with a bow.